She pointed her finger directly in his face, in front of everyone, and said, "I don't take advice from janitors." Malcolm Reed did not flinch. He did not step back. He just looked at her with eyes that had already survived things she could never imagine, and waited. That one moment on a burning runway, in front of her engineers, her pilots, and her entire world, that moment was about to cost Vivian Cole everything she thought she knew about power. But here's the part nobody talks about. Malcolm almost walked away. And if he had, her jet never would have flown that day. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Let's get into it. The radio on Malcolm Reed's belt crackled twice, then went dead. He shook it, hit the side of it the way a man does when he already knows it's broken and is just buying himself a second before dealing with the next problem. The thing had been dying for 3 weeks. He had taped the battery compartment shut with electrical tape, so old it was more gray than black. And every single morning, he told himself he'd replace it before his next shift. He never did. Because replacing a radio meant spending $12 he had already moved somewhere else in his head. Jaden needed new sneakers. The electric bill was sitting on the kitchen counter with a yellow past due sticker on the envelope. The transmission on his truck was making a sound he recognized, a tired, grinding reluctance. The kind of sound that meant it wasn't asking for attention anymore. It was demanding it. $12 for a radio. That was a luxury right now. So Malcolm worked in near silence, the way he had been working for the past 3 years. Careful, efficient, and mostly invisible. Hargrove Executive Air was not the kind of place that hired men like Malcolm Reed for anything glamorous. It was a private aviation terminal on the western edge of the city, the kind of facility that existed to serve people who owned aircraft the way regular people owned cars. The terminal building had tinted glass and a marble lobby, and a waiting area that smelled like real leather. There was a coffee bar inside that charged $18 for an espresso. Malcolm had walked past it every morning for 4 months without ever going in. His job was ground support, fuel line checks, pre-departure walkarounds, basic mechanical inspection on the smaller service aircraft that the terminal used internally. He was contract labor, meaning he had no benefits, no union protection, no guarantee that his badge would still work next Monday. The company that had placed him here was called Temp Air Solutions, and they paid him $22 an hour, which sounded reasonable until you understood that they billed Hargrove $68 an hour for his time, and pocketed the difference. Malcolm knew this. He had known it for years, about every contracting arrangement he'd ever been placed in. He had stopped being angry about it somewhere around year 2 of doing this kind of work. Anger was expensive. It cost energy he needed for other things. He was 44 years old, 6'1", with hands that told his entire story. Wide, calloused, with grease permanently settled into the creases around his knuckles, no matter how hard he scrubbed. His uniform was the gray and navy coveralls the Temp Air issued, with a small embroidered logo on the chest that nobody ever read. His boots were steel-toed and functional, the leather worn to a soft mat on both toes from years of ducking under aircraft bellies. He kept them clean. That was something his father had told him. A man's shoes tell people whether he respects himself. And even in the worst times, Malcolm had held on to that. He was on his knees near Bay 7, running a pressure check on a fuel coupling, when he heard the convoy. 3 black SUVs came through the service gate hard, tires loud on the concrete, and that alone told him something. Private aviation clients usually move through the terminal with a certain deliberate slowness, a performance of calm, like time didn't apply to them. When they moved fast, it meant something had gone wrong in their schedule. And when something went wrong in a rich person's schedule, the temperature around them dropped about 20 degrees. Malcolm didn't look up right away. That was also something he had learned. At facilities like this, a contract worker who looked up too fast, who seemed too curious about the clientele, made himself visible in a way that was rarely useful. He noted the sound, categorized it, and kept his hands on the coupling. It was the voice that made him actually stop. "Where is my aircraft? Which one of you is the lead mechanic? Somebody needs to be talking to me right now." He had never heard Vivian Cole's voice before, but he would have known the energy anywhere. It was the voice of a person who had spent so long having their questions answered immediately that the concept of waiting had become physically offensive to them. It was precise, clipped, and cold in the way that only comes from never having to soften yourself for anyone. Malcolm stood slowly and turned. She was already on the tarmac, walking toward the main hangar in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers that had no business being on a runway in July heat. And she moved like the concrete was inconvenient rather than hot. Two assistants were almost jogging to keep up with her. Behind her, three men in dress shirts with their sleeves rolled up were pulling roller bags and tablets and trying to look useful. Her jet, a Gulfstream G650, tail number N117VC, was sitting at the far end of the terminal apron, and even from a distance, Malcolm could see the problem before he knew what it was. He couldn't have explained how. It was just something in the posture of the aircraft. The ground crew was clustered around the nose, which meant the engines hadn't turned over. The aircraft had been pushed back, positioned, connected, and then nothing. It wasn't going anywhere. A man Malcolm recognized as the terminal's head of flight operations, a guy named Peterson with a red face and a loud way of talking, was moving quickly toward Vivian Cole from the direction of the main building. He had his headset around his neck and his tablet in his hand, and he was already explaining himself before he reached her. "Ms. Cole, we've run diagnostics twice. The startup sequence is initiating, but not completing. Our lead avionics engineer has been on it for 40 minutes. I don't want a status update, Peterson. I have a board meeting in Geneva. I need to be wheels up in 30 minutes. We understand that. Do you? Because I'm looking at my aircraft sitting on the ground, and I'm not hearing a solution." Malcolm turned back to his coupling. He exhaled slowly through his nose. He had heard enough. More than enough, actually. Because the moment Peterson said, "Startup sequence initiating, but not completing," Malcolm's brain had already started moving through possibilities the way it always did. It was automatic. 17 years of working on aircraft had built a kind of diagnostic reflex in him that he couldn't turn off, even when he wanted to. Some men heard music and felt the rhythm without trying. Malcolm heard a mechanical problem described, and his mind started eliminating causes the same way. Startup initiating but not completing. On a G650, that narrowed it considerably. Either the fuel control unit was feeding bad data to the FADEC, the engine management computer, or there was a fault somewhere in the starter system itself. If their diagnostics had run twice and found nothing definitive, it probably wasn't the FADEC. The computers were good at catching FADEC issues. They weren't as good at catching intermittent electrical faults. A loose connection. A relay that was making contact on the test, but not under load. He knew this because he had seen it before. Not on a G650 specifically, but on a Challenger 350, 3 years before everything fell apart. A loose starter relay contact that the automated systems kept misreading as functional because the resistance was within spec at rest. It only showed its true character under the thermal and mechanical stress of actual startup. The computers always chased the data. The data said it was fine. It wasn't fine. Malcolm kept his eyes on his work. He had absolutely no reason to say anything. This was not his aircraft, not his contract, not his problem. He was a temp worker on the other side of the tarmac, doing a pressure check on a fuel coupling, and the fastest way to make his life harder was to walk toward a furious billionaire and tell her team, who had been working this problem for 40 minutes with better equipment than he'd ever been given, that he thought he knew what was wrong. He understood exactly what would happen. He finished his pressure check. He wrote the reading in his log. He stood up, picked up his tools, and began walking toward the equipment shed. He got about 30 feet before he stopped. He stood there for a moment, toolbox in hand, back to the scene behind him. Jaden, he thought, just keep your head down. You've got a shift Friday and another one Tuesday. Don't do this. He turned around. Peterson saw him coming, and for a second looked genuinely confused, the way people look when something doesn't fit the category they've already built for it. Malcolm was walking with purpose, but without urgency. Not aggressive, not submissive, just direct, and that combination apparently didn't compute. "Hey, Reed? This isn't your bay. You need to stay on the west side." "I heard the issue," Malcolm said. He said it simply, not challenging Peterson, just stating it. "I might know what it is." "Your team is ground support. This is—" "I know what it is," Malcolm said again, and this time his voice was just slightly quieter, which somehow made it carry more. Vivian Cole had stopped walking. She was about 15 feet away. One of her assistants was saying something to her, and she wasn't listening to it. She was looking at Malcolm with an expression that moved through several stages in about 3 seconds. Annoyance, assessment, dismissal. "Who is this?" she said, not to Malcolm, to Peterson. "He's temp air contract, ground support. He was working a fuel check in Bay 7. He shouldn't be over here." Vivian looked at Malcolm the way a person looks at something they need to categorize quickly and move past. Her eyes went from his face to his uniform, to his hands, to his boots, and the whole trip took maybe 2 seconds. "You do fuel lines," she said flatly. "Among other things," Malcolm said. "This is a Gulfstream G650. Do you know what that is?" Rolls-Royce BR725 engines. Full authority digital engine control. Honeywell Primus Elite Avionics Suite. "Yes, ma'am. I know what it is." Something shifted in her expression. Not softening, not impressed. More like recalibration. She hadn't expected that. "There are 4 certified avionics engineers on this aircraft right now," she said. "They have been unable to identify the fault. What makes you think—" "Because I don't think it's in the avionics," Malcolm said. "I think it's in the starter relay. Specifically, I think there's an intermittent contact fault that the diagnostics are reading as within spec because they're testing resistance at rest. The fault only opens up under load during the startup sequence. The computers are chasing the wrong problem because the system is telling them everything's fine." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. It was one of those silences that has texture to it, where you can feel different people inside it, doing different things. Peterson was angry. The engineers behind Vivian were looking at each other. One of her assistants had stopped typing on a tablet. The pilot, standing near the aircraft stairs, had turned and was now watching. Vivian Cole looked at Malcolm Reed. "You've been standing on the other side of this tarmac," she said, "listening to a 2-sentence description of a startup failure, and you're telling my engineers, 4 certified professionals, that they've been chasing the wrong problem for 40 minutes? "Yes," Malcolm said. Her face did something that was almost a smile, but wasn't. It was more like the expression a person makes when they encounter something they find vaguely offensive. "That is either very brave or very stupid," she said. "Probably both," Malcolm said. "But I'm right." She stepped closer to him. Malcolm did not step back. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know who you are, Miss Cole." "Then you know that if you touch that aircraft, and you make this situation worse, I will make a single phone call that ensures you never work within 100 miles of a runway again. Do you understand that?" Malcolm looked at her for a moment. He thought about the electric bill on his kitchen counter. He thought about Jaden's sneakers. He thought about the truck. "Yes," he said, "I understand that." "Then why are you still standing here?" "Because in 30 years of working on aircraft, I have been wrong about a starter relay exactly once. And that time, I was 22 years old, and I was hungover." One of the engineers behind Vivian made a sound. Not a laugh, something between a scoff and a laugh. The kind of sound you make when you want to dismiss something but can't fully commit to it. Vivian Cole looked at him a moment longer. "You have 1 minute," she said. "If you move one wire out of place, if you disconnect anything you are not authorized to touch, I will have you escorted off this property, and I will personally see to it that Temp Air Solutions loses this contract by end of business today. Are we clear?" "We're clear." "Then stop talking and go." He walked to the aircraft alone. No toolkit beyond what was on his belt. A multi-tool, a flashlight, a pair of nitrile gloves he pulled from his breast pocket. The engineers watched him from a distance, with the specific expression of professionals watching someone do something they're confident is wrong. It was not hostile exactly. It was anticipatory. The way people stand when they're waiting for someone to embarrass themselves. Malcolm pulled on the gloves and ducked under the nose. The starter relay housing on a G650 is accessible through a panel just forward of the nose gear well. He had opened one before, not on a G650, but on a similar airframe, and his hands moved to it without hesitation. The panel screws were standard quarter-turn fasteners. He worked them open with a flat head on his multi-tool. 1, 2, 3, 4, and eased the panel down. He shone his flashlight inside. He saw it immediately. The connector on the starter relay, a 15-pin Deutsch connector, had a locking tab that was seated but not fully engaged. A millimeter, maybe 2. The kind of gap that looked fine visually, that read within spec on a resistance test, that a computer would never flag because the connection was technically made. But under the electromagnetic load of the startup sequence, the connector was micro-moving. Just enough. Just enough to break the circuit at exactly the wrong moment. Malcolm reached in with 2 fingers. He pressed the connector home until he heard and felt the lock engage. A soft, definitive click. The kind of sound that a mechanic who has done this long enough recognizes the way a doctor recognizes a clean suture. He closed the panel, turned the fasteners back, stood up. He walked back toward the staircase, where the pilot was still watching him. "Try your APU startup," Malcolm said. The pilot looked at him, then looked past him at Vivian Cole. She gave the smallest nod. The pilot went up the stairs. 30 seconds. The auxiliary power unit on the G650 is designed to come up fast. It's built for quick-turn operations. But those 30 seconds felt enormous. Every person on that tarmac was absolutely still. No one spoke. The July heat pressed down on all of them equally, and nobody moved. Then the APU spooled up. Clean. Smooth. The particular harmonic of a well-maintained turbine coming to life properly. No stuttering. No interruption. Just the steady building whine of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. 12 seconds after that, the left engine began its startup sequence, and completed it. The right engine followed 4 seconds later. The Gulfstream G650 sitting on the tarmac at Hargrove Executive Air, which had been dead on the ground for 47 minutes while 4 certified avionics engineers ran diagnostics, was now alive, engines running, ready to fly. Nobody said anything. Malcolm stripped off his gloves, folded them, and put them in his pocket. He turned around. Vivian Cole was standing exactly where he had left her. Her face had changed. Not dramatically. She was not a person given to dramatic public expressions. But the careful composure she had been wearing had a different quality now. Something underneath it had shifted. Peterson looked like he was going to be sick. The four engineers were doing the specific thing that professionals do when they've just been shown up by someone outside their category. They were looking at each other, looking at the aircraft, looking at their tablets, doing anything that wasn't looking at Malcolm. Malcolm walked back toward Vivian Cole. He stopped at a respectful distance. 15-pin Deutsch connector on the starter relay, he said. Locking tab was 98% seated. Your diagnostic systems read it as fully engaged because the resistance measurement was within tolerance at rest. Under the electromagnetic load of the startup sequence, it was micro-displacing, just enough to open the circuit. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, without satisfaction, like a mechanic explaining a fault to the people who needed to understand it. Vivian Cole looked at him for a long time. "Your name," she said finally. "Malcolm Reed." Something happened to her face then. He watched it happen, and he didn't fully understand it at first. A slight pause, a narrowing of the eyes that was not suspicion, but recognition. The kind of recognition that comes with something attached to it. Behind her, one of the engineers had gone completely still. He was staring at Malcolm with an expression that had moved beyond surprise into something harder to read. "Trident Air," the engineer said. Not a question. The name landed on the tarmac like something dropped from a height. Malcolm looked at him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You're that Malcolm Reed." And there it was, the moment that changes the shape of a story. Because on the tarmac, with the jet engines running behind them and the July sun burning down on all of them, the name Trident Air did not arrive softly. It arrived the way things arrive when they have weight behind them, years of it compressed into a single reference. Vivian Cole's expression shifted again, this time towards something more careful. "Someone tell me what Trident Air is," she said. The engineer opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Malcolm. Malcolm looked back at him and said nothing. 3 years ago, the engineer said slowly, there was a near-miss incident at Trident Air's maintenance facility in Charlotte. A regional jet was cleared for departure with a fault in the thrust reverser system. The FAA launched an investigation. The mechanic who signed off on the inspection was blamed for the failure. He paused. That mechanic's name was Malcolm Reed. The tarmac was absolutely silent except for the running engines. Vivian Cole turned to look at Malcolm. "Is that true?" she said. Malcolm held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "that's true." And then, because it had never been enough to just say yes to that question, because his name had been attached to that story for 3 years, and it had cost him everything, and he was tired, deeply bone-tired of carrying only half of it, he said one more thing. "What they left out," Malcolm said, his voice still level, still quiet, "is that I submitted a written safety concern about that thrust reverser system to my supervisor 8 days before that aircraft was cleared, in writing, with my signature on it. And the company buried it to protect the 2 senior managers who made the call to pass that aircraft anyway." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I was the easiest person to blame. Nobody cared what I'd written. Nobody cared that I'd tried. The engines behind him hummed. "Until now," he said, "apparently nobody with real power ever looked close enough to ask." He looked directly at Vivian Cole when he said that last part. Not with anger, not with accusation. With the calm, undeniable steadiness of a man who had been telling the truth for 3 years and had simply been waiting for the right room to say it in. Vivian Cole, who had built a billion-dollar investment empire by reading situations faster and more accurately than anyone in any room she'd ever walked into, stood on that tarmac under the July sun and said absolutely nothing. Because she understood, in the way that sharp people understand things they don't want to admit, that she had just humiliated the most capable person on this runway, and that she had done it in front of witnesses, and that the man standing in front of her had fixed her jet anyway. The heat didn't break. The sun kept burning. The engines kept running. But something else had just broken open. Something that had been sealed shut for 3 years under paperwork and silence, and a company's need to protect itself. And Malcolm Reed, in gray and navy coveralls, with electrical tape holding his radio together, and worn boots that still shone because he respected himself. Malcolm Reed was still standing. Still standing. Nobody moved first. That was the thing Malcolm would remember later. Not the heat, not the sound of the engines, not the way Peterson kept looking between him and Vivian, like he was watching a tennis match he hadn't been invited to. What he would remember was that nobody moved, because nobody knew what they were supposed to do next. The situation had left the script entirely, and they were all standing in open territory without a map. Then Vivian Cole did something unexpected. She turned to Peterson and said, very quietly, "Clear the tarmac." "Ms. Cole, your departure window. If we don't get you taxied in the next—" "I said clear it." Peterson opened his mouth, thought better of it, and started moving people. The engineers gathered their tablets. The assistants drifted back toward the terminal. The ground crew found somewhere else to be. Even the pilot, who had come back down the stairs after confirming the engines were running, took one look at the expression on Vivian Cole's face and retreated to the aircraft door without being told. In less than 90 seconds, it was just Vivian and Malcolm on the apron. The engines of the G650 hummed behind them, patient and indifferent. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. It was not an uncomfortable silence, not for Malcolm anyway. He had learned, in the years since Trident Air, to be comfortable in silences that other people found difficult. Silence was just space. It didn't owe him anything, and he didn't owe it anything. 8 days, she said finally. Yes. You submitted the safety concern in writing 8 days before that aircraft was cleared. Yes. And your supervisor? His name was Gerald Hatch, Regional Maintenance Director. He had the report on his desk by Tuesday afternoon. The aircraft was cleared the following Wednesday. Vivian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Did you follow up? Twice. Once in person, once in writing again. The second written request I sent copied to the facility manager, a man named Doug Crenshaw. He and Hatch had worked together for 11 years. Malcolm paused. I found that out later. What happened after the incident? The FAA opened an investigation. Trident's legal team moved fast. Within 72 hours, my signature on the original inspection form, the pre-incident one, was the only document that existed in the investigation file. The safety concern reports I had submitted were gone. Not misplaced. Gone. The internal email thread where Hatch acknowledged receipt of my first report. Gone. And you had no copies? Malcolm looked at her. I had copies. Something moved through Vivian's expression. Then why? Because I had a 4-year-old son and no savings, and a lawyer who told me I could fight it for 3 to 5 years in federal court. Probably lose anyway, because Trident had a legal department with 12 attorneys, and spend everything I had, everything, with a child depending on me. He said it without emotion, Not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd already felt it completely, years ago, in a way that had burned clean through him. So I accepted the FAA censure. I lost my certification for 18 months, and Trident Air made sure every major carrier and charter operation in the Southeast knew my name before I ever got a chance to apply. Vivian was quiet. "Who else knew?" she asked. "About the reports?" "A few people at the facility. Nobody wanted to get involved." I understood it. I didn't like it, but I understood it. When a company that employs 200 people tells you that the troublemaker is gone and things are going back to normal, most people decide to believe that's true. "That's cowardice," Vivian said flatly. "That's survival," Malcolm said. "There's a difference. People with mortgages and kids don't get the luxury of courage as often as people think." She looked at him sharply at that, and for a second he thought he'd overstepped. He held her gaze and didn't apologize for it. He wasn't in the business of apologizing for true things. Vivian looked away first. She looked at the aircraft. Then she did something he genuinely didn't expect. She exhaled. Not a sigh, not frustration. Something more honest than that. Like a person releasing a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't need to, I do, and I'm not in the habit of offering them, so I would appreciate it if you let me finish." Malcolm said nothing. "I looked at you, and I made a decision in about 2 seconds," she said. "I decided what you were, what category you fit, and I spoke to you in a way that was beneath what I should be." She paused. "That's not who I intend to be. I intend to be someone who reads situations correctly. Today, I didn't. That bothers me more than the delay does." Malcolm considered that. There was something real in it. He could tell the difference between a performed apology and an actual one. And this was an actual one, even if it was delivered with the careful precision of a woman who was not accustomed to giving them. "All right," he said. "Is that it? All right?" "You apologized. I heard it. That's what an apology is for." She almost smiled at that. Almost. It came and went so fast he wasn't entirely sure he'd seen it. "You are a very unusual man, Mr. Reed." "Malcolm." "Malcolm," she said at once, like she was confirming something. "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer. That's generally how I prefer to operate. Do you have documentation, the originals of those safety reports, the email receipts, anything that can be verified?" The question landed differently than he expected. Not because it surprised him, but because of how specifically she asked it. Not, "Did you ever have documentation?" Not, "What happened to the copies?" She asked if he had them now, present tense. He studied her for a moment. "Why?" "Because if you do," Vivian said, "then what happened to you at Trident Air was not just a personal injustice. It was a systemic one. And systemic things, when documented, can be addressed." "Addressed," Malcolm repeated. He said the word the way you say a word when you want to look at it from all sides before you accept it. "That's a careful word. I use careful words when I mean careful things." "Ms. Cole." "Vivian." He paused at that, the social adjustment of it. "Vivian. I've had my name in 2 newspaper articles and 1 aviation industry blog about the Trident incident. None of them were favorable. I've had people in this industry look at my name on an application and stop reading. I have a son who asks me sometimes why I don't work on real planes anymore, and I tell him I'm in between positions. And he's 11 now, which means he's old enough to know that's not entirely true." He stopped. "I'm not looking for someone to rescue me. I'm not interested in a crusade. I go to work, I do the job right, I go home. "And yet you walked across this tarmac when you didn't have to," Vivian said, "when it was clearly the harder choice." He didn't answer that, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer felt private. "I'm not offering you rescue," she said. "I'm not built for that kind of thing anyway. What I'm telling you is that I have resources, and I have attention, and I have a very strong interest in aviation safety because I am on private aircraft approximately 200 days a year. And what happened at Trident Air, if your account is accurate, represents a failure I am personally exposed to every single time I fly." My account is accurate. "Then I have a selfish reason and a principled reason to care," she said. "And in my experience, problems get solved fastest when those two things align." Malcolm looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. She was not performing sincerity. She was stating logistics, and there was something more trustworthy about that than if she had been warm about it. "I have the documentation," he said. "All of it?" "Everything I filed. Both reports. The email acknowledgement from Hatch. I had printed it before they cleaned the servers. I had a friend in IT at Trident who told me 2 days before the investigation went formal that the digital records were being managed. So I printed what I could, and I kept it." "Managed," Vivian said, in exactly the same tone Malcolm had used for addressed. "Yes." "Where is it now?" "A fireproof box in my apartment." She nodded slowly, and he could see her mind working behind her eyes, organizing, sequencing, evaluating. He recognized it. He did the same thing with mechanical faults. His version just looked different from the outside. "I need to make my meeting in Geneva," she said. "But I am going to give you a number, and I want you to call it before Thursday. My operations director. His name is Warren Lyle. Tell him I asked you to call, and tell him I said to clear 2 hours." "2 hours for what?" "For you to tell him everything you just told me, with documentation, so that we can understand what we're actually looking at before we decide how to move." She held up one hand before he could speak. "No commitments, no promises, just a conversation. I do not make decisions based on tarmac conversations, and frankly, you shouldn't either. You don't know me." "No," Malcolm said. "I don't." "But you will." She said it without arrogance, just as a fact. "One more thing." "Yeah?" "The position you're in, contract ground support, temp air placement. Is that your ceiling right now, operationally?" He felt something move through him that he didn't name. "Currently, yes." "That is a waste," Vivian said, simply and without ceremony. "What I watched you do in the last 20 minutes, the diagnosis, the repair, the way you explained the fault afterward, that is not ground support work. That is senior fleet maintenance. You know it, and I know it. And frankly, the 4 engineers standing behind me knew it the moment you explained that relay." "Knowing something and being able to do anything about it are different," Malcolm said. "Yes, they are." She looked at him. "That's what I'm suggesting might change." She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a card. Not a business card, just a small ivory card with a handwritten number on it. She held it out. He took it. Their hands did not touch, but the exchange felt significant in the way small things sometimes do when they happen at the exact right moment. "Thursday," she said. "I'll think about it." "Malcolm." "Yes?" "I just watched you walk into something that had every chance of humiliating you, with nothing but a pair of nitrile gloves and 30 years of knowledge. And you were right." She looked at him evenly. "You already thought about it. You think about everything before you do it. That's why I trust the call will happen." She turned and walked toward the aircraft stairs without waiting for a response. Malcolm stood there and watched her go. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not that afternoon, not on the drive home, not when he picked up Jaden from his after-school program, and his son threw his backpack in the back of the truck and immediately started talking about a kid at school named Devin who could apparently do a backflip from a standing position and was generally considered a hero among the 6th grade. Malcolm drove and nodded and asked the right questions and let Jaden talk, which was the best part of his day, always. The 45 minutes in the truck, where his son's voice filled up all the space that work left empty. "Dad, you okay?" Jaden had his mother's eyes. Wide set, dark, with an observational quality that had been present since he was about 3 years old. The ability to look at his father and read something that Malcolm hadn't said out loud. It was occasionally inconvenient. "I'm good," Malcolm said. "Why?" "You've got that face." "What face?" "The one where you're thinking about something big, but you don't want to talk about it yet." Malcolm glanced at his son, 11 years old, wearing a slightly too big hoodie with a cartoon rocket on it, currently reading his father like a book. "I had an interesting day," Malcolm said. "How interesting?" "I'll tell you when I know more about it." Jaden seemed to accept this. He had grown up with the rhythms of his father's processing, understood that Malcolm moved through things at his own pace, and that pushing never helped. He turned back to the window. "Devin really can do a backflip," he said. "It's not a lie. I watched it happen." "I believe you," Malcolm said. At home, after dinner, after homework, after Jaden had finally been redirected from his tablet to his bed, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he wasn't paying attention, and he took the ivory card out of his pocket and put it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. Warren Lyle. The number was handwritten in a clean, precise script. No title, no company logo, just a number. He sat with it for a long time. Not because he was uncertain about whether he would call. Vivian had been right about that. He had already decided. But because the decision felt bigger than just a phone call, and he wanted to be honest with himself about that before he went any further. Calling that number meant opening the Trident Air story again. It meant pulling that fireproof box out from under his bed and handling the documents he hadn't looked at in over a year, because looking at them too often did something to him that he couldn't afford on weekdays. It meant trusting, at least provisionally, a woman he had met 2 hours ago on a runway. A woman who had looked at his boots and decided he was nobody before she decided he might be useful. He didn't trust easily. He had learned that lesson at Trident Air, specifically, watching people he had worked beside for 6 years disappear when it mattered. Not bad people necessarily, just people who calculated risk the way everyone does, and decided that the cost of standing up was higher than the cost of standing down. He couldn't be angry at them anymore, but he also couldn't unknow what that felt like. The coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. He thought about what Vivian had said. Problems get solved fastest when selfish reasons and principled reasons align. There was a cynicism in it that he recognized, because it matched his own experience of how the world actually operated. But there was also something honest about it. She hadn't pretended her motivation was purely moral. She had told him the truth about why she had skin in the game. That was more than most people did. He turned the card over. There was nothing on the back. He thought about Jaden, not just Jaden's future in the abstract way parents do, but specifically, the conversation they'd had 3 weeks ago, when Jaden had found one of Malcolm's old certification documents in a drawer while looking for tape. The document was from 2015, before Trident, when Malcolm had been lead maintenance supervisor at a regional carrier in Atlanta. Jaden had brought it to the kitchen and held it up and said, "Dad, it says here you're a level 4 avionics maintenance supervisor. What does that mean?" Malcolm had taken the document and put it back in the drawer and said something about old paperwork. "But what does it mean?" Jaden had asked again. "It means I used to have a fancier job title," Malcolm had said. Jaden had looked at him with those eyes and said, "Is that why you're sad sometimes?" And Malcolm had said, "No," which was not entirely a lie and not entirely the truth. He picked up the card. He didn't call that night. It was too late, and he wanted to be clear-headed when he did it. But he put the card in the small ceramic dish on the kitchen counter, the one where he kept his keys and his wallet, because putting it there was a commitment. That dish meant tomorrow. That dish meant the thing was going to happen. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for an hour. He lay on his back in the dark and thought about the sound the relay connector had made when he seated it properly. That soft, definitive click. The feeling in his fingers when something that was wrong became right. He had missed that feeling. Not the praise, he had never needed that. Not the status or the title or the salary, though the salary had mattered, especially now. He had missed the feeling of a problem yielding to knowledge, the specific satisfaction of a system that was broken, becoming whole because of something he understood and applied correctly. There was nothing in the world that felt quite like it, and he had spent 3 years doing just enough of it, in small ways, in invisible corners of facilities where nobody was watching, to keep that part of himself from dying. He thought about the sound of those engines coming alive. He slept. Wednesday morning. He got Jaden to school, drove to a short-term contract inspection job at a cargo facility on the east side, and spent 6 hours doing logbook reviews and visual inspections on a fleet of aging turboprops that the operation kept running through a combination of solid maintenance and optimistic thinking. It was straightforward work. He did it carefully. On the drive home, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't pick up. He had a rule about unknown numbers, born from the period after Trident, when certain calls meant lawyers or collection agencies, or people he didn't want to talk to. But something made him answer. "Malcolm Reed." "Mr. Reed, this is Warren Lyle. I work with Vivian Cole. I apologize for calling before Thursday. She wanted me to reach out sooner." The voice was direct, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who spent a lot of time managing complicated information. Malcolm pulled into a parking lot out of habit when the conversation shifted to something that required full attention. "Okay," Malcolm said. "She briefed me on what happened yesterday, in some detail." A brief pause. "Including what you shared about Trident Air and the safety reports." "She didn't waste time." "She doesn't, no." There was something in his voice, not warmth exactly, more like a kind of professional respect for efficiency. "I've spent this morning pulling publicly available records on the Trident Air investigation. The FAA file, the NTSB correspondence, the settlement documentation." Another pause. "Mr. Reed, there are some things in the public record that don't align with the version of events that Trident Air communicated to the press and the industry." Malcolm sat very still in the parking lot. "What kind of things?" "The timeline of the inspection sign-off, for one. There are timestamps in the FAA filing that place the authorization of departure approximately 40 minutes after a communication with the regional director's office. That's not standard. Under normal procedure, that authorization would come before or concurrent with the director's office communication, not after." "They walked it backwards," Malcolm said. "They backdated the authorization to make it look like the sequence was normal." "That's a significant allegation." "It's what happened." "Yes," Warren Lyle said. "Based on what's in the public record alone, I'm inclined to believe you. Which is why Vivian wants to move the meeting to tomorrow, if you're available." Malcolm looked through the windshield at nothing in particular. A car went by. A woman walking a dog. Normal afternoon things in a normal part of the city. "I'm available," he said. "10 a.m. Our office is in Midtown. I'll text this number the address." "All right." "Mr. Reed, one more thing." "Yeah, the engineer on the tarmac yesterday. The one who identified you from the Trident incident." "What about him?" "His name is Daniel Park. He worked at a maintenance facility in Charlotte for 4 years, starting about 8 months after the Trident incident. He's told Vivian that he heard, at the time, from people who knew the Trident maintenance team, that the safety reports you filed had been real, and that the internal story didn't match what was made public." Malcolm was quiet. "He wanted you to know," Warren said, "that he's sorry he didn't say anything then, and that if there's ever a proceeding where his account would be useful, he's willing to give it." The parking lot was very quiet. "Tell him I heard that," Malcolm said. He ended the call and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. It was strange what that did to him. Not the legal implication of it, his mind would get to that, but just the fact of it, that someone, somewhere, had known, had heard the truth, and carried it around and felt bad about carrying it. He had spent 3 years wondering if anyone besides himself actually knew what had happened, or if the story had been clean enough that everyone who heard it simply believed it. Someone had known. He wasn't as alone in it as he'd thought. He drove home. He took the fireproof box out from under his bed. He sat at the kitchen table and opened it. And for the first time in a long time, he spread the documents out in front of him without looking away. 2 safety reports, dated and signed. A printed email with Gerald Hatch's name in the sender line, time-stamped, acknowledging receipt. A second email thread between himself and the facility manager. A handwritten note he had almost forgotten. A note from a coworker named James, slipped under the door of his locker the morning after the investigation began, that said only, "I know you tried. I'm sorry I can't say it out loud." He had kept the note. He hadn't known why at the time. Now he thought maybe he had kept it because it was proof that silence wasn't the same as agreement. That sometimes people knew the truth and couldn't speak it, and that was different from not knowing. He organized the documents. He made clean copies. He put them in a folder with a label he wrote in his careful, block letter handwriting. Trident Air, original documentation. Then he made dinner, because Jaden was coming home in an hour, and he was hungry, and none of this changed that. And some things were the same, regardless. But something in the apartment felt different. Not lighter exactly. More like honest. Like a room that's been closed for a long time when you finally open the window and the air moves, and you remember that air is supposed to move. Malcolm stood at the stove and listened to it. The folder sat on the passenger seat the whole drive to Midtown, and Malcolm was aware of it the way you're aware of something that has been quiet for a long time and is now making noise again. Not loud noise, just the kind of low, persistent sound that a thing makes when it knows its time has come. He had told Jaden that morning he had a meeting, a job interview, he said, which was not entirely a lie and not entirely the truth. And Jaden had looked at him over his cereal with those eyes and said, "Is it about yesterday?" Malcolm had stopped. "What do you know about yesterday?" "Devin's older brother works at the executive airport on Route 9, Jaden said. He texted Devin that some contract mechanic fixed a Billionaire's jet, and then there was a whole thing on the tarmac. Devin told me at school." He picked up his spoon. "I figured it was probably you." Malcolm had looked at his son for a long moment. "How'd you figure that?" "Because," Jaden said, like it was the simplest thing in the world, "you're the best mechanic I know." Malcolm had not had a response to that. He had poured his coffee and looked out the kitchen window and collected himself, and Jaden, who understood when his father needed a moment, had gone back to his cereal without pressing it. That was the moment he carried into the building with him. Warren Lyle's office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower that announced itself modestly from the outside and expansively from the lobby. The kind of building that spent its money on interior architecture the way certain people spent it on watches, as a signal to those already inside, rather than those passing by. The receptionist took his name without ceremony and pointed him to a seating area where the chairs were real leather and the coffee was self-serve and actually good, which Malcolm noted because in his experience, the quality of the lobby coffee was an accurate indicator of how the people inside treated their time. He didn't sit. He stood near the window with his folder and his coffee and looked out at the city and waited. Warren Lyle came out to get him personally, which was the first thing Malcolm registered. Not an assistant, not a call over an intercom. The man came out himself, hand extended, direct eye contact, the kind of handshake that communicates that the person has thought about what a handshake means. He was mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the unhurried quality of someone who had learned decades ago that urgency was mostly theater. He wore no tie. He looked like a man who had been in enough serious rooms that he no longer needed to perform seriousness. Malcolm. Warren. Good to put a face to the name. Likewise. Vivian's already inside. She moved 3 calls to make this morning work, so she's present. A slight pause that communicated something Malcolm filed away. Come on. The conference room was smaller than Malcolm expected. Not a boardroom, a working room, with a round table that said, "Everyone here is equal," and a whiteboard on one wall that had a faint ghost of previous writing on it that hadn't been fully erased. Vivian Cole was seated with a legal pad in front of her, and she looked up when he walked in without the performance of surprise that people sometimes did when they were expecting you. "Malcolm," she said. "Ms. Cole." "We said Vivian." "Vivian," he said. He sat down across from her. Warren took the chair to his left. "You brought the documents," she said, looking at the folder. "I did. May I?" He slid the folder across the table. She opened it carefully. The way a person handles something they understand has weight. And she began reading. She did not skim. She read the first safety report fully, then the second, then the email from Gerald Hatch, then the second email thread. She read the handwritten note from James last, and she held it a moment longer than she held the others. Warren was reading alongside her, his own copy of the publicly available FAA records open on the table in front of him, cross-referencing as he went. The room was quiet for several minutes. Malcolm drank his coffee. Finally, Vivian looked up. "The timestamp on Hatch's email acknowledging your first report is 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday," she said. "According to the FAA investigation file, the maintenance authorization for that aircraft is logged at 3:15 p.m. on the following Wednesday, 9 days later." "Yes. But the departure clearance, the actual gate release, is time-stamped at 2:58 p.m. that same Wednesday." 17 minutes before the maintenance authorization, Malcolm said, which means the aircraft was cleared to push back before the maintenance sign-off was formally logged. They authorized departure, then backdated the paperwork. Warren set down his pen. In the public investigation narrative, Trident's position was that the maintenance authorization preceded departure clearance, and that the fault was in the inspection process, specifically in the inspector's sign-off. "Which was my signature," Malcolm said, "on the original inspection form, which I signed correctly and on time. What I did not sign, what nobody at Trident ever produced, was a clearance form for departure. Because I never cleared that aircraft for departure. Hatch cleared it, after I had already flagged the system fault in writing. Twice." Vivian looked at him. "Why wasn't the discrepancy in the timestamps in the public record?" "Because the investigation happened fast, and Trident cooperated just enough to control the direction of it. They gave the FAA what they asked for. The FAA asked for inspection records, and they got inspection records. My signature was on them. The fault was documented post-incident, and the narrative wrote itself. Nobody asked for departure clearance authorization records separately. Or if they did, what they received was the version Trident provided. And your attorney at the time didn't catch it. He was doing personal injury work, not aviation regulatory law. I couldn't afford an aviation specialist. Malcolm said it plainly, without bitterness. A proper aviation attorney would have caught the timestamp discrepancy in the first week. I know that now. I knew it 2 years ago. Knowing it didn't change it. Warren spoke quietly. The statute of limitations on an FAA enforcement action challenge is— I know what it is, Malcolm said. It's not why I'm here. Both of them looked at him. I'm not here to sue Trivent Air. I'm not looking for a settlement. I don't want their money. He said it evenly, clearly, making sure both of them heard it accurately the first time. What I want is for the documentation to exist in a form that can't be buried again. I want someone with the reach and the resources to put this in front of the people who can make it a structural issue rather than a personal one. Right now, there are mechanics at facilities across this country who are in the same position I was in, who see something wrong, who file the report correctly, and whose reports disappear when the company decides that fixing the problem is less important than protecting the people who ignored it. He let that sit for a second. That's what I want changed, not revenge. The system. Vivian had stopped writing on her legal pad. She was looking at him with an expression that was harder to read than any she had shown him on the tarmac. More internal, more genuine. I told you I use careful words when I mean careful things, she said. You did. What I'm about to say is more than careful. It's conditional, it's complicated, and it will require things from you that are not comfortable. So I need you to hear it fully before you respond. I'm listening. She looked at Warren briefly, then back at Malcolm. I sit on the board of an aviation safety nonprofit, the National Aircraft Maintenance Standards Coalition. It's small, but it has FAA relationships, and it has congressional contacts. 2 years ago, we drafted a proposal for a protected reporting system for maintenance workers, similar to what already exists in other sectors. But we couldn't move it because we had data and we had argument, and we did not have a human story. Something specific, documented, and verifiable, with a real person attached to it. She paused. We have been looking for the right case. Not a tragedy. There are too many tragedies, and they produce outrage, but not policy. We needed a case where someone did everything right, documented everything correctly, and was still destroyed by the system they were trying to protect. The room was quiet. You are that case, she said. If you're willing. Malcolm sat with that. He understood what she was describing. He had been in enough rooms where people talked about policy to know that human story was not a cynical phrase. It was the actual mechanism through which abstract systems became concrete reform. He didn't love the idea of his name and his worst years becoming a mechanism. But he was old enough and honest enough to know that his discomfort was not the most important thing in the equation. What does it require? He asked. Congressional testimony, potentially. A formal submission to the FAA with your documentation. Your name attached to the proposal publicly. You would not be anonymous. I haven't been anonymous since the Trident story ran, Malcolm said. The industry already knows my name with that attached to it. At least this version would have the actual truth. There may be pushback, Warren said. Trident Air still exists. Their legal team is still functional. If this gains traction, they will respond. They already took everything from me once, Malcolm said. The things I have left, my son, my integrity, what I know, those aren't things they can reach. Warren nodded slowly. Vivian wrote something on her legal pad. The second thing, she said, is the position. I meant what I said on the tarmac. I want you overseeing my aircraft fleet. All of it. I have 6 aircraft, 3 based here, 2 in Europe, 1 on a long-term charter in Southeast Asia. I need a director of fleet maintenance. Someone with real authority, real accountability, and the kind of judgment that cannot be taught in a classroom. She looked at him directly. I am aware that I am offering you this after knowing you for approximately 20 hours. I am aware that you have reason to be skeptical of powerful people who appear to be offering help. The thought had occurred to me, Malcolm said. Then I'll say this. You can verify everything I'm telling you. The coalition is public. The board members are listed. The proposal history is documented. Call any of them. I'll give you names. And the employment offer will be in writing with full terms before you decide anything. No handshakes, no good faith assumptions. Paper. Why? Malcolm asked. She looked at him. Because I read people for a living, and I know that's the only offer you'd actually trust. He almost laughed at that. Not quite, but close. There's something I need to tell you, he said, before this goes any further. Go ahead. The day of the Trident incident, the near miss, there were 3 other mechanics in that facility who knew about my reports. Not just James, who wrote the note. 3 others. One of them was a man named Curtis Bell. He was senior to me, 10 years in the industry, respected by everybody. When the investigation started, Curtis was interviewed by Trident's internal review team. Malcolm stopped. He told them he had no knowledge of any safety concern being raised prior to the incident. The room was quiet. He lied, Vivian said. He had a wife and 2 daughters and a mortgage, and he had been at Trident for a decade, Malcolm said. I don't think he's a bad man. I think he was scared, and I think he made a choice that people make when they're scared. And I've had 3 years to understand that, even if I can't accept it. Why are you telling us this now? Because if this becomes a formal proceeding, testimony, FAA submission, anything public, his name may come up. And I want it on the record, right here, that I am not doing this to destroy Curtis Bell. I want the system changed. I don't want people hunted. There's a difference. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face that was more personal than professional. Something that looked almost like recognition. The kind that comes from seeing a version of a quality you've been trying to develop in yourself. Noted, she said, and respected. Warren was writing. He looked up. The coalition attorney will need to review the documentation before we move forward formally. We can have her reach out this week. Her name is Sandra Okoye. She's handled 3 FAA whistleblower cases, all successfully. She'll tell you honestly what you're looking at legally before anything is committed. That's fair, Malcolm said. One more thing. Vivian set her pen down and folded her hands on the table. The 4 engineers who were on the tarmac yesterday, the ones who spent 47 minutes chasing the wrong problem. What about them? 2 of them have worked with my fleet for 3 years. They are competent professionals. What happened yesterday was not incompetence. The diagnostic equipment was reading within spec, and they followed the data. They followed the wrong data, but they followed it correctly. She paused. My point is that what you did yesterday was not just better than them. It was different from them. You heard something they didn't hear, because you have a kind of knowledge that doesn't come from equipment. It comes from years of being close to the machines themselves. She looked at him steadily. That is what I want in charge of my fleet. Not someone who trusts the data. Someone who trusts the data and knows when the data is lying. Malcolm looked at her for a moment. That is the most accurate description of aircraft maintenance I have ever heard from someone who doesn't work on aircraft. I pay attention to the things that keep me alive at 40,000 feet, she said. I've had reason to. There was something in the way she said it, a weight behind it, that suggested a specific reason rather than a general one. He didn't ask. That was her story, and she would tell it on her terms, or not at all. I'll meet with Sandra Okoye, he said, and I'll review the written offer. I'm not saying yes to anything today. I wouldn't trust you if you did, Vivian said. He stood. Warren stood with him. They shook hands again, the same kind of handshake as before. Substantive. Present. Warren, Malcolm said, about Daniel Park. The engineer. Tell him I don't hold it against him that he didn't speak up in Charlotte. He was in the same position everyone was in, and he was further from it than the people who were actually there. Malcolm picked up his folder. But tell him, if there comes a point where his account is useful, I'll be grateful for it. I'll tell him, Warren said. Malcolm walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it. One thing I want to say, he said, half turning. Both of you. I appreciate what's being offered here. I want to be clear that I understand the weight of it and I'm not treating it lightly. He paused. But I also want to be clear that I'm not coming into this as someone who was saved. I was doing the job right before all of this happened. I kept doing it after, and I'll keep doing it, regardless of how this goes. Whatever comes next, I'm a partner in it, or I'm not in it at all. Vivian Cole looked at him. That, she said quietly, is exactly why I'm asking. He left. He took the elevator down and walked through the lobby and pushed through the glass door into the air outside. And for the first time in a long time, the outside air felt like something other than the distance between the last place and the next one. He sat in his truck for a moment without starting it. His phone buzzed. A text from Jaden's school. Reminder about a parent-teacher conference next week. He looked at it and thought about what Jaden's teacher would say. She was a woman named Ms. Farrow, who had twice told him that Jaden was extraordinarily analytical for his age, that he approached problems by breaking them into smaller parts and working through each one, rather than trying to solve them all at once. Malcolm had nodded politely when she told him that, the way you nod when someone tells you something about your child that you already know in your bones. He started the truck. On the way home, he thought about the meeting. Not strategically, not yet, but emotionally, which was the pass he always made first, before the analytical one. He thought about how it had felt to put those documents on a table in front of people with actual resources and have them be taken seriously. Not with pity, not with the particular gentle condescension that well-meaning people sometimes offered when they engaged with someone else's injustice. With the specific, focused attention of people who understood that the documentation was not just personal evidence, but structural evidence. Proof of a failure that repeated itself constantly in facilities across the country. In every form, every time, a worker who knew something true was made to pay for knowing it. He had spent 3 years carrying a story that nobody with power had ever heard the right way. Today, it had been heard. He didn't celebrate it. He wasn't built for celebration in advance of outcomes. And he'd been around long enough to know that the distance between a good meeting and a real result was often considerable. But he noted it. The way you note a change in weather, not because the storm is over, but because the sky is doing something different than it was before. He was almost home when his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize, different from the one Warren had called from. He answered. "Mr. Reed." A woman's voice, precise, businesslike, with a warmth underneath it that she wasn't entirely hiding. "My name is Sandra Okoye. Warren Lyle just called me. I'd like to set up a time to talk." "That was fast," Malcolm said. "Vivian doesn't wait on things she considers important," Sandra said. "I've learned not to either." A beat. "I've handled 3 FAA enforcement challenges in the last 8 years. All 3 involved workers who filed safety reports that were subsequently suppressed. All 3 resulted in policy recommendations." Warren mentioned. "What he may not have mentioned," Sandra said, "is that in 2 of those 3 cases, the companies involved had active relationships with the same third-party legal consulting firm that Trident Air used during their 2021 investigation." Malcolm felt something shift in the air of the truck. "What firm?" "A group called Meridian Regulatory Partners. They specialize in aviation compliance management. What they actually do, in practice, is help companies manage the optics of safety incidents in ways that minimize regulatory exposure and maximize narrative control. They're reputation fixers," Malcolm said. "That is a blunt way to put it that I would not use in a legal document, but is essentially accurate." She paused. "Your case and 2 others I've handled share Meridian's fingerprints. The same patterns. Fast internal reviews, documentation gaps, worker signatures on forms that became the focal point of investigations while authorization chains were not examined. If your documentation says what Warren described, we may be looking at something that extends well beyond Trident Air's facility in Charlotte." Malcolm pulled into his parking spot and sat there with the engine running. "You're saying it was a system," he said. "I'm saying it was a method," Sandra said carefully. "Used more than once, by people who understood how to use it. And if we document it properly, with corroborating cases and verifiable evidence, it stops being a story about one mechanic and one company. It becomes a pattern. And patterns, when they're documented and placed in front of the right people, become policy." Malcolm sat in the quiet of his truck. He thought about the morning of the Trident incident, the phone call that had woken him at 5:47 a.m., his supervisor telling him there had been an emergency return, a thrust reverser fault on departure. He had been out of bed and dressed before the call was over, because the first thing he'd thought was not about his job or his certification. The first thing he had thought was about the passengers on that aircraft, who had no idea how close they had come to something that his report, had it been read and acted on, would have prevented entirely. He had thought about them every single day since. "Mr. Reed?" Sandra's voice, careful and present. "I'm here," he said. "When do you want to meet?" "Tomorrow, if you're able." "I'm able." "Bring everything you have, originals and copies. I'll need to photograph and certify them." A brief pause. "And Malcolm, I want to say something that is outside my professional capacity, but that I think is appropriate." "Go ahead." "You've been carrying this alone for 3 years. You did the right thing at Trident Air, and the right thing cost you nearly everything. I've seen that happen before, and I understand what it does to a person." She said it simply, without theatrics. "I want you to know that the people in this room now, Vivian, Warren, myself, we understand what that cost was. We're not treating this lightly." Malcolm let that land. He didn't rush past it. "Thank you," he said. "Tomorrow then, 9 a.m. Warren will send the address." He ended the call and sat for another moment. The engine was still running. He turned it off. The truck went quiet. He looked at his apartment building. Jaden was up there, probably doing homework at the kitchen table, probably also watching something on his phone that he would minimize suspiciously when Malcolm walked in. There would be dinner to make and questions to answer, and the small, ordinary machinery of an evening that would look exactly like every other evening. Except it was different. Malcolm could feel that it was different. Not in a dramatic way, not fireworks, not vindication, not any of the clean emotional categories that stories were supposed to produce. Something more complicated and more honest than that. Like a weight he'd been carrying so long, he'd forgotten he was carrying it, had shifted on his shoulder. Not gone, just different, distributed differently. He got out of the truck. He went upstairs. Jaden was at the kitchen table, homework open, phone face down in a position that was supposed to look casual and did not. "How was the meeting?" Jaden asked, not looking up from his notebook. "Good," Malcolm said. "Good like regular good, or good like actually good?" Malcolm hung up his jacket. He went to the kitchen and started looking through the cabinet for what to make for dinner, moving through it with the same methodical deliberateness he brought to everything, and he thought about how to answer that accurately. "Actually good," he said. Jaden looked up from his notebook. He looked at his father the way he always looked at him, fully, without performance, and whatever he saw in Malcolm's face made him nod once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Okay," he said. He went back to his homework. Malcolm started making dinner. Outside, the city kept moving. Somewhere across town, Sandra Okoye was reviewing FAA files. Somewhere, Daniel Park was carrying a 4-year-old Gilt a little differently than he had this time yesterday. Somewhere, in the offices of a company called Meridian Regulatory Partners, people were going about their business with no idea that a folder of documents from a fireproof box under a bed in a one-bedroom apartment was now in the hands of someone who knew exactly what to do with them. And in a kitchen that smelled like garlic and olive oil, Malcolm Reed cooked dinner for his son and thought about how sometimes the truth does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives the way a relay connector seats properly, with a quiet, definitive click, felt more in the hands than heard, signaling not a resolution exactly, but the moment before one. The moment when something that was wrong begins, finally, the process of becoming right. Sandra Okoye's office did not look like a place where industries got changed. It looked like a place where a person had been working very hard for a very long time. Bookshelves that had stopped being organized somewhere around the 3rd year and become instead a functional archaeology. Stacks of case files on the credenza, 2 monitors on the desk with windows open on both, and a small framed print on the wall behind her chair that said simply, "Do the work." No inspiration around it, no decorative border, just the words, like a reminder she had stopped needing, and kept anyway, out of honesty about who she'd been when she hung it. She stood when Malcolm came in, and shook his hand with the directness he was coming to associate with the people in Vivian Cole's orbit, a quality that felt less like a personality trait and more like a professional standard, a shared language among people who had decided that clarity was more respectful than performance. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee?" "Please." She poured from a carafe on the credenza without asking how he took it, which meant Warren had briefed her. He took the mug, and she sat across from him, and she looked at the folder he placed on her desk the way a surgeon looks at an instrument tray, assessing, cataloging, preparing. "Walk me through it," she said. "Not the documents yet. Just the sequence. Tell me what happened in the order it happened. Don't edit it for me. Don't compress it. I need the full timeline." So Malcolm told it. He told it the way he had been telling it in his own head for 3 years. The pre-inspection, the fault identification, the first report filed, the follow-up, the second report, the acknowledgement from Hatch, the silence after the acknowledgement, the morning of the incident, the investigation, the documents disappearing, the attorney who wasn't equipped for it, the censure, the industry blacklist that was never formal and never needed to be. He told it without embellishment and without minimizing, and Sandra listened the way serious people listen, not nodding along, not making affirming sounds, just present and absorbing, with her pen resting on her legal pad, but not moving yet. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many times have you told that story?" "The accurate version? Twice. Yesterday to Vivian and Warren. Today to you." "The version you told the FAA investigators?" "That version was interrupted about 4 minutes in by Trident's attorneys, who requested a recess and then presented the investigator with a document package that reframed the entire examination. After that, I was answering their questions, not telling my story." Sandra wrote something. "And your attorney didn't object to the reframing?" "He objected twice. Both times the investigator, a man named Greer, acknowledged the objection and kept going in the direction Trident's attorneys had set. He wasn't corrupt, I don't think. I think he had a completed narrative in front of him. It fit the evidence he'd been given, and he had 12 other cases on his docket." "Greer is retired now," Sandra said. "But his investigative record is public. This won't be the first time his methodology has been questioned." She said it as information, not accusation. "Tell me about Meridian Regulatory Partners. When did you first encounter that name?" "I didn't. Not until you mentioned it yesterday. I knew Trident had outside legal consultation during the investigation. That was obvious from how organized and rapid their response was. But I didn't know the name of the firm until the call." "Meridian was retained by Trident Air approximately 36 hours after the incident," Sandra said. "I have their billing records from a separate discovery process in an unrelated case. They were on site in Charlotte by the following morning." For context, an internal investigation of this nature would normally take several days to mobilize external counsel. 36 hours is not mobilization. That's a standing relationship. Malcolm looked at her. "They had them on retainer." "For exactly this kind of situation, yes. Which tells you something about how Trident Air understood their own operational risk. You don't keep a rapid response regulatory management firm on retainer unless you have reason to expect you'll need rapid response regulatory management." She met his eyes steadily. "Which means the leadership at Trident Air knew, institutionally, that their safety reporting processes were inadequate. They knew it was a matter of when, not if, and they had prepared accordingly." The room was very quiet. "They were ready for me," Malcolm said slowly. "They were ready for whoever it turned out to be," Sandra said. "It happened to be you. A single mechanic, no union representation, no aviation-specific legal counsel, a young child, limited resources. From a purely cynical strategic perspective, you were the easiest version of this problem they could have encountered." Malcolm sat with that. He had known pieces of this, had assembled them in the years since, in the particular way that people who have been wronged assemble understanding in private, in the dark, without anyone to confirm or deny what they're figuring out. But hearing it said plainly, in the clinical language of someone who had worked 3 similar cases and understood the architecture of it, felt different from knowing it alone. It felt like a room finally having its lights turned on. The furniture was all exactly where he'd known it was, but the visibility changed something. "What do we have?" he asked. "With what's in this folder and the corroborating material from the other 2 cases I've handled, we have enough to file a formal petition with the FAA's Office of Audit and Evaluation requesting a review of the 2021 Trident Air investigation. Not a reinvestigation of the incident itself, but a procedural review. Specifically, an examination of whether the investigation was conducted with full access to relevant documentation and whether the outcome reflects the complete evidentiary record. And if the FAA agrees to review it, then everything that was buried comes up. The timestamp discrepancies, the safety reports, the Meridian involvement and its implications for the integrity of Trident's cooperation with investigators. All of it becomes part of an official federal record. and Trident's legal team will respond. Aggressively, Sandra said, without hesitation. I want to be very clear with you about that. The moment we file, Meridian will be involved within days. They will challenge the petition procedurally. They will attack the documentation chain. They will question the timing. Why is this coming up 3 years later? Why now? What changed? They will look very carefully at your connection to Vivian Cole and characterize this as a personal grievance being amplified by a wealthy backer. It is a personal grievance, Malcolm said. It's also the truth. Yes, both things can be true simultaneously. That's actually helpful to us. It means we don't have to hide the personal dimension. We just have to demonstrate that the personal dimension is grounded in verifiable fact. She looked at him. Are you prepared for your name to be in the news? My name has been in the news, the wrong version of it. This time, it will be louder. Good, Malcolm said simply. Sandra looked at him for a moment, the way she had been looking at him throughout, with a focused attention that was evaluating not just what he said, but how he said it, the consistency between his words and his effect, the quality of steadiness in a person who had been asked to do an uncomfortable thing. I've done this 3 times, she said. The first client, a cargo aircraft maintenance supervisor named Robert Thill, was offered a settlement by the company 4 months into the process. He took it. He had a right to, and I supported his decision. But the settlement was confidential, which meant the pattern we were building died with his case. She paused. The second client stayed in it all the way. Took 2 years. The FAA review found procedural irregularities in the original investigation and issued a corrective guidance memorandum to the relevant regional office. It was a real result. It was also quiet. A memorandum to a regional office is not a headline. And the third? Still pending, she said it carefully. What I'm telling you is that if what we're building here is what I think it is, Meridian's involvement in multiple cases, a repeating pattern, a systemic failure in how safety reports are handled, then the third case and your case together become something different. Something that doesn't end with a memorandum to a regional office. What does it end with? Potentially, federal legislation. The Protected Aviation Maintenance Reporting Act has been in committee for 4 years. It has sponsors, but it has never had the specific, documented, human-centered evidentiary foundation that moves a committee from interested to committed. She met his eyes. Vivian's contacts on the Hill have told her that the bill's lead sponsor, a senator from Ohio named Patricia Mercer, has been waiting for exactly this kind of case. Malcolm exhaled through his nose. That's a long road. Yes, Sandra said, it is. I won't tell you otherwise. What I will tell you is that every mile of it matters, and that the people around you now know how to walk it. He nodded. Then let's start walking. They spent the next 2 hours going through the documents one by one, Sandra photographing each one with a certified timestamp, annotating her legal pad with questions and connections, asking Malcolm to clarify specific details about handwriting, dates, the chain of custody for each piece of paper. It was methodical work, the kind that felt slow until you understood that slowness was its structural integrity, that everything built on top of it would be only as solid as the foundation laid right here, in this office, over these 2 hours. At one point, Sandra held up the handwritten note from James, the one left in Malcolm's locker the morning the investigation began, and looked at it for a long moment. Have you been in contact with him? Not in 3 years. He transferred to another facility about 6 months after the incident. I have an old phone number. I'd like you to try it. Not to pressure him. His account won't be central to what we're building. And if he says no, we move forward without it. But a supporting declaration from a witness who was present at the facility, even a limited one, strengthens the context of the safety culture we're describing. I'll try, Malcolm said. When they finished, Sandra walked him to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. One thing I want you to understand, she said. When this starts moving, and it will move, there will be a moment when you're asked to stand in a formal setting and say in front of people with authority exactly what you've said to me today. Not to me, not to Warren, not to Vivian. To people who represent the institutional system that failed you. That moment will be more uncomfortable than anything you've done so far. She looked at him steadily. I've watched good people get to that moment and hesitate. Not because they doubted the truth, because they doubted whether the truth would be enough. Will it be? Malcolm asked. It's always been enough, she said. The question is whether it's finally in the right room, and I believe it is. He shook her hand and left. The call to James happened that night, after Jaden was in bed. Malcolm sat in the kitchen with the old number on a piece of paper in front of him and his phone in his hand, and he thought about what to say. Not a script. He had never been good with scripts. They made his voice wrong. Just a sense of the shape of it. Honest, low pressure, a door opened rather than a demand made. He dialed. It rang 4 times. He was already composing the voicemail in his head when the line opened. Hello? A man's voice. Cautious in the way voices are cautious when they don't recognize a number. James, it's Malcolm Reed. A long pause, long enough that Malcolm counted the seconds without meaning to. Malcolm. Not a question, not surprise exactly. More like the sound of something that had been anticipated, arriving on the schedule it was always going to arrive on. I wondered when I'd hear from you. How are you? I'm okay. I'm in Denver now, maintenance supervisor at a regional carrier. A pause. You? Working contracts. Slowly less of that, maybe. I heard about the tarmac thing. Hargrove executive. It moved around the industry fast. Word travels, Malcolm said. Malcolm. James stopped himself. Started again. I've thought about you. What happened? About what I should have done. You don't need to. I want to say it. I was there. I knew what you'd filed. I knew Hatch had buried it. When the investigators came, I had a choice, and I made the wrong one. And I have thought about that. About you. About the passengers on that aircraft. About what could have happened. I have thought about all of it more times than I can count. His voice was controlled but tight, like a person saying something they have rehearsed alone and are now saying out loud for the first time to another person. I was wrong. What I did was wrong. I'm sorry. Malcolm let the silence breathe. I know, he said finally, and I hear it. Is that enough? It's what an apology is for, Malcolm said. The same thing he'd said to Vivian, in a different register, carrying a different weight, but the same principle. James, I'm calling because things are moving now. There's an attorney named Sandra Okoye. She's filing a petition for procedural review of the Trident investigation. I'm not asking you to be central to anything. I'm not asking you to put yourself at risk. But if there comes a point where a supporting statement about the safety culture at the facility, not about your specific choices, just about what the environment was like, if that's something you'd consider, I wanted you to know it would matter. Another pause. You're not angry at me, James said. It wasn't a question. It was genuine bewilderment. I was, Malcolm said, for a long time. But I've got a son, and I've spent 3 years trying to teach him that how you carry something matters as much as what happened to you. I can't carry anger at you and teach him that at the same time. James was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. something released in it. "Send me the attorney's information," he said. "I'll call her this week." "Thank you, James." "No," James said. "Thank you. For calling. For not being who I probably deserved." Malcolm ended the call and sat in his kitchen in the quiet and thought about the nature of people. How the same fear that made them fail you could, if given enough time and enough distance, become the thing that brought them back. He didn't have a neat name for that. He just knew it was real and that it mattered. 3 days later, he met with Warren Lyle again, this time at Vivian's offices, and Warren laid the employment contract on the table between them. Director of Fleet Maintenance, Cole Aviation Holdings. Salary, benefits, travel provisions, authority structure, performance review timeline. All of it in writing. All of it clean. All of it exactly as described on the tarmac, without a word changed to favor the employer. Malcolm read it fully, every page, because that was what the document deserved, and he asked 4 questions, and Warren answered each one directly. And at the end, Malcolm took the pen that Warren offered and signed it. He did not feel what he expected to feel. He had expected something grand, relief, triumph, the emotional equivalent of an engine coming to life. What he felt was quieter and more durable than that. Something closer to alignment. The feeling of a person who has been walking sideways for years, taking a step in the direction they were always supposed to be going. "One more thing," Warren said, gathering the contract pages. "Vivian wants to see you before you leave. She's upstairs." Vivian's actual office was on the top floor and looked like Sandra's, less like a monument to success, and more like a place where work happened. Big windows, yes, but the desk faced away from the view, which Malcolm noted, because it meant she had deliberately positioned herself to not be distracted by it. The view was for visitors. She looked at documents. She was on a call when he came in, and she held up one finger, not impatiently, just informatively, and finished the call in 45 seconds, in a way that communicated to whoever was on the other end that the conversation was complete. "Contract signed?" she said. "Signed." "Good." She looked at him. "I heard James Whitfield called Sandra." "Fast news in your organization." "I pay people to keep me informed. It's how I stay ahead of problems." She sat back slightly. "That was a good call to make. I know it wasn't easy." "A lot of things that aren't easy are still right," Malcolm said. "Yes." She paused. "I wanted to tell you something before you start Monday. I want to say it once, and then it's done, and we move forward." "Okay." "When I looked at you on the tarmac and decided what you were in 2 seconds, that was not an aberration for me. That's a habit. A fast-read habit that has served me well in some contexts and failed me in others, and I have been aware of the failure pattern for some time without doing enough about it." She was precise and unsentimental about it, the way she was about most things. "What I saw when I looked at you was a set of external markers, the uniform, the boots, the contractor badge, and I built a complete picture from incomplete data. I do that with companies when I evaluate investments, and I do it, apparently, with people. The difference is that with companies, my fast-read failures cost me money. With people, they cost something that doesn't recover as cleanly." "Why are you telling me this?" Malcolm asked. "Because you're going to be in my organization now, and I need you to know that I understand what I did and that I intend to do differently. Not as a performance, not because it affects how you work for me, but because—" She stopped, and for the first time since he'd met her, she seemed to be searching for the precise word, which was unusual, because she was a woman who usually had the precise word waiting. "Because you deserved better than you got from me in the first 30 seconds. And saying so out loud is the only way I know to actually commit to a change." Malcolm looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "I mean it." "I know you do," she said. "You're not particularly interested in saying things you don't mean. I've noticed." "It wastes time." "It does." Something moved through her expression that was as close to warmth as he had seen from her. Not performed warmth, but the kind that existed in people who kept it in a specific compartment, and only opened the compartment when the situation earned it. "There's one thing I want to ask you, personally. You don't have to answer." "Go ahead." "Your son, Jaden." She said his name carefully, like she had thought about using it. "What does he know about all this?" Malcolm thought about it. "He knows I fixed a jet. He knows something is moving. He doesn't know the legal details. He's 11, and that's not his weight to carry." "Does he know you were wronged at Trident?" "He knows I had a hard time after a job. He knows it wasn't my fault. I've never told him the specifics. I didn't want him to grow up angry at a system before he'd had a chance to figure out the world on his own terms." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "When do you plan to tell him?" "When there's something true to tell him that isn't just the injury," Malcolm said. "When there's also the answer. I want him to hear both at the same time." She looked at him for a long time. "That might be the wisest parenting decision I've ever heard described," she said. "I've had 3 years to figure out the right time," he said. "I'm patient when I need to be." He said goodbye and rode the elevator down and walked to his truck in the afternoon light, and sat for a moment with his hands in his lap. He thought about Monday, reporting to a new facility, a new level of authority, the particular experience of walking into a place as the person who was responsible, rather than the person who was contracted. He had done it before. He knew how to carry it. He was ready to carry it again. But before Monday, there was Friday. And Friday meant Jaden's parent-teacher conference with Miss Farrow. And then Saturday meant the grocery store and laundry, and the truck that still had a transmission making a sound he was going to get looked at this weekend, now that the financial pressure had shifted enough that he could think about it without the particular exhaustion of postponing a necessary thing. And Sunday morning. Sunday morning meant sitting at the kitchen table with Jaden while the city woke up outside, with coffee and cartoons and whatever Jaden was currently obsessing over, which had recently migrated from the backflipping Devon to a documentary series about deep-sea submarines that Jaden watched with an intensity that suggested a possible engineering future that Malcolm filed away without mentioning. Those things were not small. They were not the background of the story. They were the reason the story existed. He started the truck. His phone buzzed on the seat. A text from an unsaved number. He picked it up and read it. "Malcolm. This is Daniel Park. I know Warren passed along your message. I want you to know I've been carrying the Charlotte thing for 4 years. I told a few people at the time what I'd heard, and nobody moved on it. I'm glad someone is moving now. I'm in if you need me. Daniel." Malcolm read it twice. Then he set the phone down and pulled out of the parking spot and drove toward home. And the city moved around him the way it always did. Indifferent, loud, full of people carrying things they hadn't put down yet. And he thought about the shape that 3 years of a life could take when the wrong story was the only story anyone told about it. How that shape compressed you. How it became, over time, something you wore so constantly that you forgot it wasn't your original form. He was starting to remember his original form. Not the title, not the certification level, or the salary, or the company name on the ID badge. The thing underneath all of that. The version of himself that had walked into his first maintenance bay at 23 years old and looked at an aircraft engine and felt, deeply and without performance, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That man had not been destroyed at Trident Air. He had just been waiting, in worn boots, with electrical tape on his radio, for the right moment to be necessary again. The moment had come. And Malcolm Reed, director of fleet maintenance, petitioner, father, the man who listened to machines the way other men listened to music. Malcolm Reed drove home through the city with all of it held quietly inside him. The way he held everything that mattered, without showing it to anyone who hadn't earned the right to see it, and without letting go of it for a single second. The hearing room in Washington, D.C. was smaller than Malcolm had imagined it would be. He had built it up in his head over the 6 months between signing Sandra's petition and the morning he walked through the federal building's security checkpoint with his folder under his arm. Built it into something grand and intimidating, a room designed to make a person feel the weight of the institution around them. What he found instead was a conference-style space with fluorescent lighting and a long table and 7 people seated behind it, most of them with reading glasses and printed packets, and the particular expression of government officials who had seen many things and were prepared to see one more. Senator Patricia Mercer sat at the center of the panel. She was a compact woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of stillness that comes from decades of listening to people explain complicated things. She had reviewed Sandra's submission in full. Sandra had told Malcolm this, had told him that Mercer's office had called 3 times with follow-up questions, which was, according to Sandra, a very good sign. Malcolm sat at the witness table, with Sandra to his left and Warren to his right, and he looked at the panel and thought about what Jaden had said that morning when Malcolm was adjusting his tie in the bathroom mirror. "Dad, you look weird in a tie." "Thank you, Jaden." "I mean, you look good, just not like you. You look like a you that someone dressed up." "That's basically what a tie is," Malcolm had said. And Jaden had laughed, and Malcolm had kept that sound with him through the airport, and the flight, and the cab, and the security line, and all the way to this chair, because it was the right thing to carry into a room like this. Not anger. Not the accumulated grief of 3 years. His son's laugh in a bathroom on a Tuesday morning. Senator Mercer called the session to order and looked directly at Malcolm. "Mr. Reed, we've reviewed the documentation submitted by your counsel, and we've had the opportunity to examine the corroborating materials from the related cases Ms. Okoye has provided. Before we proceed formally, I want to say something for the record." She paused. "The committee is aware that you are here not as a complainant seeking personal remedy. You've stated that explicitly in your submission. I want you to know that this committee takes that distinction seriously, and that the framing of today's session reflects it. We are here to examine a systemic failure in aviation safety reporting culture. You are here as the clearest documented example of that failure. Is that an accurate characterization of your purpose?" "Yes, Senator," Malcolm said. "That's exactly right." "Then let's proceed." He told the story one more time, the version he had refined over 6 months of working with Sandra. Not dramatized, not stripped of its human texture, but organized in the precise sequence that made its structural implications impossible to dismiss. The pre-inspection, the fault, the first report, the acknowledgement, the second report, the silence, the incident, the investigation, the documents, the timeline discrepancies, Meridian regulatory partners, the pattern. He spoke for 40 minutes without notes, not because he had memorized a speech, but because he knew this material the way he knew aircraft systems. Not as a sequence of memorized facts, but as a living, interconnected body of knowledge that he could navigate from any entry point, answer questions from any angle, because he had been inside it for 3 years, and it had been inside him. The panel asked questions. Some were procedural, some were pointed. One member, a congressman from Texas named Darrell Cross, who had a reputation for aggressive skepticism about regulatory expansion, leaned forward at one point and said, "Mr. Reed, you've waited 3 years to bring this forward. Trident Air's attorneys have submitted a brief suggesting that the timing of this petition, coming immediately after your connection with Ms. Cole and her organization, indicates that this is being driven by an outside agenda rather than a genuine safety concern. How do you respond to that?" Malcolm looked at him evenly. "With respect, Congressman, the timing isn't 3 years after the incident. The timing is 3 years after I acquired the resources to make the truth audible." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "The documentation in your packet was created in 2021. My safety reports were filed in 2021. The timestamps on those reports and on Gerald Hatch's acknowledgement email do not change because of when I found someone willing to help me put them in front of this committee. The truth doesn't have a shelf life." Another beat. "What has a shelf life is the ability of a company to keep it quiet. That's what ran out." Congressman Cross looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something on his notepad and said nothing further. Sandra caught Malcolm's eye briefly and said nothing, but her expression said enough. Senator Mercer recessed the hearing at midday, and when they reconvened, she made a statement that Sandra had told him to listen for. The kind of statement that committees make when they have already decided something and are building the formal record to support it. "The documentation before this committee," Mercer said, "in combination with the corroborating cases presented by Ms. Okoye and the supporting declaration submitted by Mr. James Whitfield, establishes a clear and concerning pattern in how aviation maintenance safety reports are processed and suppressed at facilities utilizing third-party regulatory management services. This committee will be recommending a formal FAA audit of Meridian Regulatory Partners' involvement in aviation safety investigations over the past decade. Additionally, this hearing's record will be formally submitted in support of the Protected Aviation Maintenance Reporting Act, currently in its 4th year in committee, with a recommendation for accelerated review." She looked at Malcolm. "Mr. Reed, on behalf of this committee, I want to acknowledge that what you experienced at Trident Air in 2021 was a failure of the system that was supposed to protect you for doing your job correctly. You filed the right reports. You followed the right procedures. You raised the alarm in exactly the way the system asks workers to raise it, and the system failed you comprehensively. That failure was not your fault. This committee recognizes that clearly and intends the record to reflect it clearly." Malcolm said, "Thank you, Senator." He said it without drama, without tears, though he felt something move through his chest that he would not name in a federal hearing room. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, quietly, fully present, meaning every syllable. "One more thing," Mercer said. "For the record, the passengers on the aircraft involved in the Trident Air incident, they were never informed of how close they came to a serious event, or of the safety reports that preceded it. Does that concern you?" "Every day," Malcolm said, "since the morning it happened." Mercer nodded once. "It should concern all of us." She adjourned the session. In the hallway outside, Sandra turned to him and allowed herself something he had not seen from her before. Not a professional expression, not a calibrated response. Just a full, genuine smile, the kind that arrives when something you have worked toward for a very long time takes a step toward being real. "You did well," she said. "We did well," Malcolm said. "Yes," she said. "We did." Warren was on his phone already, stepping away to handle the first of what would be many calls in the next several hours. Malcolm stood in the hallway with his folder and his loosened tie and the particular feeling of a man who has just said the truest version of a true thing in the room where it needed most to be said. Not euphoria, not the clean resolution of a finished story. Something more like the feeling after a long surgery. Bone-tired, quiet, aware that recovery is its own long road, but also aware, finally, that the thing that needed to be removed has been removed. He called Jaden from the cab to the airport. How'd it go? It went well. Like actually well, or like you say well? Like actually well. Like they heard it. The right people heard it. A pause on the line. He could hear Jaden breathing, could hear the faint sound of the television in the background at home, could picture him exactly, on the couch, shoes still on despite the rule about shoes inside. Processing. Did you tell them everything? Jaden asked. Everything. The part about the reports you filed? The part about how they buried it? All of it. On the record. In a federal building with a senator asking the questions. Another pause. Longer this time. Dad, Jaden said. Yeah? I think... He stopped. Started again, the way 11-year-olds do when they're reaching for a thought that's bigger than their usual vocabulary. I think that's the bravest thing you've ever done. Like, not the jet thing. This. Saying the thing in front of the people who could actually do something about it. Malcolm looked out the cab window at Washington moving past. Why is this braver than the jet? Because with the jet, you already knew you were right before you started. With this, you knew you were right, but you didn't know if it would matter. And you did it anyway. Malcolm had no immediate response to that. He sat with it for a moment. His son, this 11-year-old in shoes he wasn't supposed to be wearing on the couch, who watched submarine documentaries and believed in backflips, and had spent his entire conscious life watching his father carry something heavy, without ever once suggesting his father was anything other than the strongest person he knew. His son had just articulated, with complete accuracy, the thing that Malcolm had been too close to the middle of to see clearly himself. When I get home, Malcolm said, there's something I want to tell you about what actually happened at Trident. The full version. A brief silence. Yeah? I think you're old enough, and I think you should hear it from me before you hear anything else about it, because there's going to be some news attention on this story in the next few weeks, and I don't want you walking into school and finding out from someone else. Okay. Jaden's voice was careful and attentive. I'll be here. I know you will, Malcolm said. He got home late that night. Jaden was still up, which Malcolm registered with the specific parental mixture of exasperation and gratitude that defines the relationship between fathers and children who love them too much to go to sleep on time. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the documents had been laid out, where the cold coffee had been drunk, where the ceramic dish with the ivory card had sat, and Malcolm told his son everything. Not the legal version, not the careful version, not the version edited for emotional protection. The true version, the full one, in the language of a father talking to his child about the hardest thing that ever happened to him. Jaden listened without interrupting. He sat with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands, and he listened the way he had always listened to things that mattered, with his entire self, nothing held back. When Malcolm finished, the kitchen was quiet. They lied, Jaden said. Yes. And you lost your job and your certification, and nobody believed you. A lot of people didn't. But you kept the papers. I kept the papers. Jaden was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you tell me before? Malcolm thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I didn't want you to grow up angry before you'd had a chance to decide on your own what kind of world you were in. I wanted you to know the world was worth trusting before I told you about the times it let me down. Does that make sense? Jaden thought about it seriously, the way he did. Yeah, he said. I think so. Like, you wanted me to have something to protect before you told me it needed protecting." Malcolm looked at his son. "That's exactly it," he said. "That's exactly what I meant." Jaden nodded slowly. Then he said something that Malcolm was not prepared for. Something that arrived without warning and landed with the full weight of everything the past 3 years had cost, and everything the past 6 months had begun to repair. "Dad," Jaden said, "I've always known you were good at your job. Like, I didn't need to see you fix the jet to know that. I've known it my whole life." He looked at him directly, with those eyes. "I just wanted other people to know it too. And now they do." Malcolm did not say anything for a moment. He could not say anything for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand on top of his son's head, the way he had done since Jaden was small enough to fall asleep in a car seat. And he held it there, and Jaden let him. And neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The story did not end cleanly. Stories about systems rarely do. The FAA audit of Meridian Regulatory Partners took 8 months and produced a report that documented pattern-consistent behavior across 11 aviation safety investigations spanning 6 years. Not criminal findings, but regulatory findings substantial enough to result in Meridian losing 4 major retainer contracts before the report was even formally published. Gerald Hatch retired from aviation entirely. Doug Crenshaw, the Trident facility manager, was named in the FAA audit and faced a separate enforcement review. The company itself issued a statement that described its commitment to safety culture without once using the word accountability, which Sandra called predictable and Malcolm called honest in its way. The Protected Aviation Maintenance Reporting Act was voted out of committee 7 months after Malcolm's testimony. It passed the Senate 14 months later with bipartisan support. The floor statement from Senator Mercer cited the Trident Air case by name and referenced Malcolm Reed's testimony directly, which meant that for the first time in 3 years, his name appeared in a public document in a sentence that also contained the word truth. Sandra called him the morning the bill passed. "You should feel good about this," she said. "I do," he said. "I also feel like there are 30 other mechanics somewhere right now who are in the same position I was in. And the bill passing is step 1 of about 50. "Yes," she said, "it is." "Are you still in for the rest of them?" "I'm still in," he said. At Cole Aviation Holdings, Malcolm built the fleet maintenance program the way he built everything. Methodically, with an insistence on documentation and a standing policy that every technician on his team had the authority to ground any aircraft without fear of pressure. He said this explicitly in the first team meeting, in a room of 12 people who had been hired by various previous arrangements, and who looked at him with the careful attention of professionals who understood that the person speaking had personally paid the price for the principle he was describing. "You will never be blamed for grounding an aircraft on this team," he told them. "Not by me, not by Ms. Cole, not by anyone. If you have a concern, you file it. You tell me directly, and it gets addressed. If you file a concern and nothing happens, you come back to me and we figure out why nothing happened. If you are ever told by anyone that a safety concern is inconvenient or untimely, or that the schedule is more important, you bring it to me immediately." He looked around the room. "I've seen what happens when that system fails. I am not interested in seeing it again." Nobody in the room said anything. They didn't need to. The weight of what he'd said was self-evident, and the people in the room were professionals who understood evidence. One of them, a young woman named Torres, 26 years old, 3 years out of an aviation maintenance program, stayed after the meeting and said, "Mr. Reed, I read about the Trident case before I took this job. I wanted to work here partly because of it." Malcolm looked at her. Why? Because of what you did. Not just the jet on the tarmac, the whole thing. The reports, the testimony, all of it. She said it directly, without flattery. I wanted to work somewhere that had that standard. Malcolm thought about what to say to that. He thought about the morning in the bathroom with Jaden and the tie. He thought about a fireproof box under a bed. He thought about the specific sound of a relay connector seating properly. That quiet, definitive click. Hold yourself to that standard, he said. Not just me. Every one of us in this room. That's what makes it real. She nodded. Yes, sir. She went back to her work. And Malcolm Reed, who had spent 3 years invisible on the edges of a world that had once been his, who had done the invisible labor of surviving and raising his son, and holding on to his integrity in the specific way that requires no audience and no recognition and no proof to anyone but yourself. Malcolm Reed walked out of that meeting room with the easy, unhurried stride of a man who knew where he was going and why. Not because the system had finally seen him, but because he had never stopped being exactly who he was when it couldn't. That was the thing about truth. It didn't need to be loud. It didn't need an audience, or a title, or a clean resolution, or a perfect ending. It just needed to be true, completely and without compromise, even in the years when nobody was watching. Malcolm Reed had kept it true, and that, in the end, above everything else, was the thing that no company, no investigation, no silence, no system, and no billionaire's first impression had ever been able to take from him.